as you can tell, the economy wore me down. Now, I was 6'4" 4 years ago. In truth, I've always been, I've always been very, very short, and as a kid, as many of you, but I was even more, I was bullied. At the bus stop and at school, and the guys, and it was normally guys, there weren't very many women bullies, but the guys who had, who were bigger, who had the power, would take it out on me. And I began to think that maybe I had to stand up to the bullies, but one way I stood up to the bullies was I found allies. I found other people who were also intent on avoiding the bullies. And together, we actually stopped the bullying. One of my friends, by the way, who I could rely on, was a guy named Mickey. And Mickey became a close friend, and then in 1964, Mickey went down south to register voters. His name is Michael Schwerner, and Mickey, along with 2 other civil rights workers, were murdered. And that murder of Mickey by the bullies down there, were not just bullying, but were killing and torturing and murdering, was a wake-up call to me that not only did I have to help organize people to prevent the social, structural, massive bullying that was going on, not only in the South, but all over America, but that it was an ongoing struggle. Ongoing struggle, not just the civil rights movement, but an ongoing struggle for all of us, black and Latino and white and middle class and working class and poor, an ongoing struggle against the bullies. And the only way we have any strength against the bullies is when we are united with others. And that's why when one of my very, very best, perhaps my best graduate student at Berkeley, Philip Cryan, asked me to come out here and be with you. Yeah, go ahead and applaud. Philip, where are you? Because he told me what you were doing. Faith-based groups and community groups and labor unions coming together against the economic bullies in our society in Minnesota and then spreading across the country. I could not refuse. I had to be here. Because there's more bullying going on in our society right now than I have known or seen in decades. Now, during the Vietnam War, that was a form of big bullying that was going on. I was one of those, like perhaps some of you, I went clean for Gene McCarthy. Your fine state produced a man who led the way against Vietnam, and I marched across America and organized states, and I was single-handedly responsible for bringing the Vietnam War to a close. Of course I wasn't. We worked together. I mean, there was a huge unity. I mean, Martin Luther King in his last months, his last years, what was he concerned about? He was concerned about Vietnam. He was concerned about the war economy. He was concerned that that was diverting attention from what we needed to do at home. And years later, when I went to Washington, and I can tell you it's not easy in Washington, being Secretary of Labor, being in the White House, none of that is easy. Nothing good happens in Washington unless people outside Washington are organized and mobilized and energized to make sure that good things happen in Washington.
That's right. Yeah.
No matter who's there. And sometimes I would get discouraged. Sometimes I'd just get feeling, the tides of corporate power, and the moneyed interests were overwhelming. And where would I go just to get a lift, just to get inspired? I'd go to my friend Paul Wellstone. And Paul and Sheila always lifted my spirits. They were guaranteed to lift my spirits. Paul was, as you, those of you who were lucky enough to work with him and remember him, Paul was an optimist. Anything could be done, and it could be done if people got together. He was a great, great organizer. And if Paul were here today, I kind of asked myself, what would Paul do? Well, he would get you so excited. He would have you standing in the aisles. He would have you marching out of here, and you would change America. Well, I'm not Paul. I can't do that. But what I can do is tell you what's happened and what needs to happen, and why what you're doing, the coalition you're building, is so important. Now, I work for President Obama. I think he's a good man. He's an intelligent man. I think he wants to do the right thing. But I'm afraid that once he was elected, and I don't know how many of you remember, of course you remember, I felt that elation, that sense of extraordinary relief. We had not only elected a good man, we had elected a black man. And it felt like everything that we believed in and wanted and hoped for was finally bearing fruition. I couldn't believe it. Maybe like you, I wept. I was one of his economic advisors, and he had a meeting right after he was elected, and we were all sitting around a big table, about 15 of us, and he walked into the room in Chicago. This is about I think it's the morning after the election. He just wanted our advice. He knew he was going to have a huge economic problem on his hands, and he strode in, and I saw this man, and he came around the table and shook each of our hands, and he got to me, and I could not speak. I was choked up. I was crying. And all I could get out was, thank God. But then I and some of you made a mistake. We thought it was just a matter of electing President Obama and everything else would take care of itself. We basically pulled back. We stopped being as active as we could, and we just assumed that a good man in the White House and good people in Congress, and there were a lot of good people in Congress, still are, that they would take care of it. Well, that wasn't the case. There's more corporate money, there is more Wall Street money than ever in Washington. The right wing and Tea Partyists who are manipulated by the Koch brothers, by Dick Armey, by Karl Rove, by super PACs. A lot of them are acting not in their own economic interest, they're acting out of ideology that is backed in turn by big lies, Orwellian lies. And what we failed to do, and I count myself among these people, is we failed to continue to be organized and mobilized and energized so that we would provide a progressive push to everything that needed to happen in Washington. And many of us just sat back and whined. Whined. How many of you have just whined? You know, partly because I was Secretary of Labor and partly because I stand out in crowds. People come up to me. They come up, people I don't know, people in airports, people in every place I go, and they whine. They say, isn't it awful? How can we get it? Isn't it awful? And they give me whatever is on their mind. They whine. I've never heard so much whining. There is a lot to whine about. The economy is awful. This is the worst economy we've had since the Great Depression. People are hurting. 25 million Americans who are underemployed, unemployed, can't find jobs. It is worse, the worst education you have. If you drop out of high school, you don't have a chance in this economy. If you finished high school, you barely have a chance. Even college, people of college degrees, young people having a hard time getting a job. If you are minority, if you're black, if you're Latino, it is harder than ever. And wages are going down for everybody. The median wage is dropping. Now, the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce, every month they report on average wages, not median wages. There is a difference. basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". Don't be fooled into thinking that averages tell you much, because averages are always brought up by the people at the top. So as the people at the top do better and better, average wages look better and better. But if you look at the median, that is the median wage, half above, half below, you see the median wage has been trending downward. In fact, it's been going downward since 2001. Talk about trickle-down economics. One of the big lies that we've been told over and over again for years, and again, some Americans start to believe it because they hear it over and over again, is that if you give tax cuts to the rich and to the corporations, everybody will benefit. It will all trickle down to everybody else. A lie. It has not happened. It has never happened. They don't need more tax cuts. Big corporations are now sitting on $2 trillion of cash. There are higher corporate profits now than we have seen in 35 years. The ratio of corporate profits to wages is now higher than it's been since before the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so when you hear somebody say corporations need tax cuts, or they need regulatory so-called relief, they need to cut their costs, they need, in other words, to have even more profits to create jobs, don't you believe them. That is a downright bold-faced lie. The truth is that American companies are not creating jobs because there are not enough consumers out there with money in their pockets to buy the stuff that could be produced with more capacity and more employees. That is why companies don't create jobs. Companies are not in the business of being socially nice or charitable. They only create jobs when they can make money by creating jobs, and they're not making money by creating jobs if they're not customers. And workers are consumers. Consumers are workers. 70% of this economy is consumer spending. And so when consumers who are workers don't have jobs or are afraid of losing their jobs, and their wages are going down, and their benefits are shrinking, and their mortgage is so large that a quarter of mortgage owners are underwater, that is, they owe more on their homes than the homes are worth, and the average home is 30% or 33% less in value than it was in 2006. So people feel poor, they haven't saved for their retirement, they can't send their kids to college, they worry. Well, what do you expect? Consumers are not going to spend. That's rational. And so we have a vicious cycle. Consumers are not spending, businesses are not hiring, businesses are laying off, businesses are shrinking payrolls, substituting technology, automation for workers, outsourcing abroad in order to get payroll costs down. And that means workers and consumers have less money to buy. This is not rocket science. This is not complicated. Economics 101. Now, it is true that the biggest American corporations have been scoring big profits lately because they've been going to China and India and Brazil and rapidly growing economies. And they've also been shrinking their payrolls. And by doing both, they score big profits. But that is a temporary measure. China's economy is slowing. Brazil's is slowing dramatically. Other emerging economies are all slowing. Europe is basically at a standstill. Japan is a basket case. The global economy is shrinking. And by the way, any American company that thinks that China is going to keep on being their savior, keep on consuming without Chinese companies substituting for the American companies, doesn't really understand the truth of global commerce and global politics. This is a non-sustainable, unsustainable strategy for America's biggest companies. Now, another lie we hear over and over again: if you shrink government, you'll create more jobs. This is unbelievable. How it is that by shrinking government you create jobs. I debate a lot of people, a lot of conservative economists and others on television who keep on saying this. And I keep on saying, tell me your theory. How is it that if you lay off teachers and social workers and firefighters and police officers, if you have fewer people building the roads, building the highways, building the infrastructure, fewer people rebuilding our schools, fewer people doing all of the public's work. How can that create more jobs? And the answer I get is, government always gets in the way. I say, but tell me exactly, how is it that if you shrink government, you're going to create more jobs? Particularly when consumers are holding back because they can't do it. And the answer I get is, government always gets in the way. In other words, there is no intellectual basis for the ideology, and it is purely an ideology that says, if you shrink government, you get more jobs. If you shrink government, you get fewer jobs. In fact, what we've learned since the Great Depression, and by the way, I'm not recommending a war, but we got out of the Great Depression because World War II mobilized everybody, and government spent so much money that by 1946, the debt of the United States was 130% the entire national economy. But we got everybody employed, and we had ourselves set up for an economic boom. My father, when I was a little boy, said to me, Bobby, you and your children and your children's children are going to be paying down the debt that Franklin D. Roosevelt created. He was not exactly a Roosevelt supporter, my father. But I'll tell you something. And although I was scared to death, I was 6 years old, and I remember going to sleep, I had nightmares about this debt. I didn't even know what the debt was. I had nightmares about this debt. But I'll tell you something, by the mid-1950s, nobody was talking about the Roosevelt debt. And it's not that we spent less as a nation. I mean, we had the biggest public works project we have ever had in history, the interstate highway system. We built it. We rebuilt Japan. We rebuilt Germany. We had a Cold War. We had a Korean War. We didn't spend all that much less, but the economy grew. We put people to work. And not only did the economy grow over those 3 decades, starting at the end of the Second World War, not only did the economy grow, but it grew toward more and more equality. The people at the bottom, their wages went up faster than the people at the top. The people in the bottom half, their wages went up faster than the people in the top half. Why did that happen? It happened, A, because the economy had so much force to it, B, because we had strong labor unions. 35% of our workers were in labor unions. Dr. Powell said this morning, it was the Henry Ford principle. Henry Ford was not a great man. Henry Ford had a lot of character flaws. I am not suggesting we follow Henry Ford, but he had one very good idea. And his one good idea that he had very early on, he was excoriated by other business leaders. The Wall Street Journal called him a socialist. Henry Ford paid his workers 3 times what the typical factory worker was getting at that time. And he said, I'm paying them that because they will then turn around and buy Model T Fords. And he was right. That was the basic bargain. And we made that a national bargain in the 1950s and 1960s. We had strong labor unions. The economy grew, and average working people and working class people and many of the poor, we expanded opportunity. We had a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act. We gradually expanded opportunity. Women could get jobs. Many professional women did get great jobs, but the women went into the workforce not because of professional opportunities for women. Women began going into the workforce after that era. I call it the Great Prosperity, 1946 to 1975. But then something happened. Something profound happened. Technologies, such as satellite communication technologies, cargo ships, containers, and then eventually computers and the internet and all kinds of technologies came on stream, which did 2 things. Number one, it made it easy to outsource, made it easy for companies to get stuff done abroad much more cheaply than in the United States. But it also enabled companies to substitute technology for workers even here in the United States. Now that doesn't mean we had to sit back and allow all this to happen. I don't mean we could or should have been neo-Luddites and smash the machines or be protectionists. I mean, we could have done, and I talked to some of you about this before, we could have done what Germany has done over the last 20 years. Germany, over the last 20 years, has actually emerged as the world's major high-tech manufacturing, precision manufacturing. German workers are earning, on average, on median, more than American workers by far. The top in Germany, the top 1%, you saw in that video, I said that the top in America, the top 1% was taking home over 20% of total income. In Germany, the top 1% is taking home only 11% of total income, no more than they took in 1970. In Germany, German workers are gaining a fair share of the benefits from economic growth and productivity improvements. Why? Because the German economy today, in many important respects, resembles the American economy in the first 3 decades after the Second World War. Strong labor unions. Labor unions strong enough to negotiate on behalf of middle class, working class, and the poor, and also Germany, like America in the first 3 decades after the Second World War, investing like mad in education. That's what we did. You remember the baby boomers? How many of you were born between 1946 and 1964? All of you. No. Well, we boomers had the advantage of huge investments in public education, in higher education, in public higher education, huge expansion. We invested in infrastructure, we invested in education, we had a tax structure in those years in which the top income earners never paid below a marginal income tax of 70%. 70%. In fact, under Dwight David Eisenhower, who nobody would call a socialist, I don't believe. Some would now. Yes. The top marginal income tax rate on the top earners was 91%. And even with deductions and tax credits, that still meant that they were paying an effective tax rate of hugely higher than they are today. And yet the economy grew faster. That lie about trickle-down, the lie that we must not tax the rich because that would deter them from working hard and investing in creating jobs, is nothing but a bald-faced lie, based on ideology rather than facts. Which brings us to today. The American middle class and the working class and many of the poor kept on improving their standard of living because women went into paid work. Women were always working, but they went into paid work. Many women of color were always working. And also, they worked longer hours, and also, finally, we went deeper and deeper into debt. But all of those strategies came to an end. You can't just keep on going into debt. There's a big debt bubble. It burst in 2008, if you hadn't noticed. Started to burst in 2007. What we need right now is not only a big enough stimulus, and I hate to use that word because it's now become a dirty word, a big enough economic boost, a big enough booster rocket. Call it pastrami. But when the private sector is unable or unwilling, that is consumers and businesses unable or unwilling to spend enough to keep the economy going at full employment, then government is the spender of last resort. We've known this. We've known this for 30 years. Actually, we've known it for 80 years. We've implemented it over the last 50 years. But we've known it for 30 years, even though supply-side economists have started spouting this drivel about low taxes and trickle-down economics. We've known it. But now we hear this resurgent right saying no. But beyond a large enough stimulus, and I think the president did try. I saw his speech, many of you saw his speech. He sounded as forceful, as dynamic, as strong as I have heard him, and he made all of the right comments we need. By the way, I wish he had said one thing. The primary objective is jobs, not deficit reduction. We need jobs, not more cuts in the deficit. That is the primary objective. Almost there. And he came up with a jobs plan that is a good beginning, but it's not nearly large enough to do the size of the job that we need doing in this jobs crisis, this economic crisis. But the other thing that we also must do is tackle this issue of inequality, because we are surging toward inequality. Thirdly, there were only 2 years over the past 100 years, the 2 peak years in which the richest 1% took home the largest share of total income that they've ever taken home before since. The 2 peak years, 1928 and 2007. And what happened in the year after 1928 and 2007? Bubbles burst, and economies were thrust into the Great Depression and the Great Recession. And by the way, for most Americans, we've never come out of the Great Recession. We're still in the Great Recession. So we've got to tackle inequality. How do we tackle inequality? Well, one thing we can do is have tax reform that is real tax reform, not the kind of Republican tax reform that says we've got to raise taxes on poor, which is, again, as backwards as every other lie they are telling. But the real tax reform is we've got to expand the earned income tax credit, which is a way of subsidy for the poor. We've got to reduce taxes on the middle and the lower middle, and we've got to increase taxes on the top. Have more tax brackets. More brackets. Go back to where we were before. And we've got to also invest in healthcare and in education for all Americans. Early childhood education. That's where we can start. Now, some people say, how can we afford to do all of the things that we need to do? Well, partly we raise taxes on the very rich. But is that going to be enough? No, it's probably not going to be enough. How can we afford to do the healthcare and the infrastructure spending and all of the education we need desperately to start reversing the trend toward widening inequality? Well, the way we do it is we borrow money. Right now, the 10-year Treasury note or bill, the yield is 2%. The 5-year Treasury yield is 1%. We have not had such low borrowing costs as a nation in years as we have right now. And yet we have 25 million Americans who are underemployed or unemployed looking for full-time work. And at the same time, we've got schools that are crumbling and highways that are crumbling, and we have an infrastructure that is suffering from years and years of deferred maintenance. Well, you don't have to be, again, a rocket science or a brain surgeon to understand that if you've got all of that together, what you do is you borrow, you put people to work, and you rebuild the country. Just like the 1950s, when I was told by my father the debt is going to be the biggest. No, the debt, if you get growth back, if you get jobs back, the debt shrinks as a proportion of the national economy. It becomes more and more manageable. And by the way, here's another lie. They are saying that the long-term debt that's out there 10 years from now is all because of Medicare and Social Security and all of the spending. It's not. The long-term debt out there is because of rising health care costs. Medicare is the most efficient system. The administrative costs of Medicare are so tiny relative to private insurance that what we really need, if we want to get Medicare and medical costs down in the future, is Medicare for all. Fee-for-service system to a fee-for-healthy outcome system, and that's what we need. And anybody who tells me that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, I've heard that recently. Can you imagine the irresponsibility? I mean, look at putting partisanship to one side. I've never heard a public official running for national office who lies through his teeth by saying the Social Security system is a Ponzi scheme. I was a trustee of the Social Security Trust Fund. I know exactly what the actuaries project. For the next 26 years, Social Security is purely solvent, completely solvent. There's no problem. Beyond 26 years, the only reason there is a problem with potentially being able to pay out everything Social Security owes beyond 26 years, you know why? Because of raging inequality, because so much money has gone to the top that the proportion of income subjected to Social Security taxes is not going to be enough. And that's why the easiest, most direct response to post 26 years from now is to raise the cap on proposed income. So don't believe the lies. Now then the question finally, and this is the last issue I want to discuss with you, what do we actually do besides whining? Whenever you hear somebody whine, I want you to say back to that person, so what are you doing about it? The greatest enemy we have is mass cynicism.
Yes.
Because when people really get to the point where they think nothing can be done, the other side wins. That's what they want, by the way. That's what they want. They want government because it is starved for money, because it is going to be underfunded, all the regulatory agencies. They want government at all levels to function so badly that people say, oh, well, government can't work. Told you. And they also want politics to be so bad and so paralyzed that most Americans say, nothing can be done. I'm going to give up on our democracy. They win. Don't allow cynicism to affect our body politic. Don't allow cynicism to affect your neighbors or friends or anybody. Now, Minnesota is where things begin. The progressive era, much of the progressive era in America began in Minnesota. I mentioned Eugene McCarthy. I mentioned my friend Paul Wellstone and Sheila Wellstone. Minnesota understands about organizing. Minnesota understands about politics. This gathering, community-based, faith-based, labor organizing, and labor organizers, and labor unions, you coming together present a formidable, powerful movement. And so I ask you to do this. We're going into an election year. Many of you are going to be caught up in the election. And that's understandable. We need to do our part. Many of you are going to be caught up in particular election campaigns. And that's understandable. We've got to do our parts. But we also have to think beyond the election. We've got to think about the long term. We've got to think about taking America back. And that includes not just everything I've talked about up till now, but it also includes getting money out of politics. Big money out of politics. Campaign finance reform. It includes not only all of that, and we've been through those fights, and we did pretty well. McCain-Feingold, at least for a few years, did hold back some of that money, but we have to be diligent. We have to keep working on it. And when the Supreme Court comes out and says that big corporations are people and that money is speech, well, we can't give up. We just say that was a 5-4 decision. We've got to make sure that there is a new justice on the Supreme Court, and that justice understands that that ruling has got to be reversed. There is nothing about politics or the economy that cannot be changed. We are not victims of the economy, and we are not victims of politics. The economy can and should serve us, and politics can and should serve us. We are the people. But people are disorganized. They're scared. When they are disorganized and scared, what happens, as in my 2 minutes, 15 seconds, it is easy to turn them against each other. It is easy, when they're scared and disorganized, for people to be subject and vulnerable to demagogues who come along and say to them, you know, the reason you're in trouble, The reason you're in trouble is because of government, or it's because of immigrants, or it's because of the poor, or it's because of blacks, or it's because of a number of scapegoats that are offered, always offered up. The same scapegoats. But in reality, we are all struggling over a smaller and smaller share of a bigger and bigger pie. And they are deflecting and diverting attention from the big story, which is that more and more of the income and wealth is going to the big corporations and to the very, very super rich in this country. And that is what has to be reversed, and that is why we have to take back America. Dr. Powell said this morning, this is not about making the rich an enemy. This is not about class warfare. Most people who are very wealthy, they are responsible citizens. They are not lobbying. But what happens is, when so much wealth and income goes to the top, you have the opportunity of the Koch brothers and others and big corporations to, out of their own selfish interests, to keep their taxes low, to make sure there are not reforms that spread the benefits of economic growth to everybody, to basically warp an unbalanced society in a profound way that turns us against each other. And that's why we've got to make sure that the rich and the corporations pay their fair share, but also that they don't have disproportionate amounts of political power in our society that make it impossible for us to function and basically subordinate and subdue our First Amendment rights. So what you are doing here is critically important. It's important now and throughout next year, but it's important beyond. Make sure what you do here not only takes root, and it will take root. You have wonderful soil here. Paul Wellstone and others have made sure that this state is susceptible and open, and this state is progressive in its basic premises. Make sure it takes deep root here, but also make sure it becomes a model to the rest of this country. Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. I think we do we not? We have how many? 15 total. 15 questions in 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes, an eternity, for questions. And why don't you just put your hand up and I'll call on you and then I'll repeat your question, assuming I can hear it. And if I can't answer your question, I'll make up a question that I can answer.
Hi, I'm Marcus August from North Minneapolis. I'm currently in a microeconomics class, and my professor, I hate to say it, but he's inept. He doesn't provide the definition, but he says his role as an economist is simply to define costs and benefits of economic activity. And I said, well, what about ethical considerations? And he rejects that. So what is the role of an economist?
This young man is in an economics class, and his economics professor says he doesn't want to talk about ethics, he wants to just talk about costs and benefits and efficiency. And that's understandable. That's what a lot of economists do. They say, I'm in a ethical free universe here. We're just going to talk about costs and benefits. I'm not going to talk about distribution. That's what he's really saying. I'm not going to talk about who gets what. I'm just going to talk about efficiency. Well, you might be able to remind him, and do it in a very kind and not patronizing way, because I want you to get a good grade. You might be able to remind him that in the 19th century, before Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics in 1890, it was all called political economy. Political economy. It was not economics, it was political economy. It was about politics and economics because people understood that you could not separate one from the other. And in the 18th century, it was not even political economy. It was called moral philosophy. Adam Smith did not call himself an economist. He called himself a moral philosopher. And why did he do that? Because the study of economics and politics and sociology was all wrapped up in the basic question of what is a good society and how do we get there? Adam Smith thought his best book was not The Work of Nations, but The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So respect your economics teacher, but know how little a slice you're actually learning. Yes?
Sorry.
Oh, both of you. In unison.
When you mentioned the characteristics that are hindering our ability to organize and react to what we're seeing, you left out misinformed. How do we combat misinformed and misinformation that's being
how do we deal with lies? Well, number one is to tell the truth and make sure your friends and everybody else is armed with the truth. Now, in my own little way, these little videos might be able to help you, and I have a little blog. I'm going to give you the address. It's just a little truth-telling device, and feel free to use it. It's www.robertreich.org, O-R-G, and I have videos. But there are other truth tellers out there. You just got to find them and share them. Share them. Now, we've got a lot of big lie outlets. Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Yale Radio, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Now, I don't suggest you listen to them or read them, but I do suggest that you at least know the lies they're telling. You know, we really do, in this country, have got to talk to each other and talk to people who disagree with us. So one thing I would ask you to do is not only create more and more solidarity among people like yourselves, have this group grow and grow and grow, but also, along the way, when you come across people who disagree with you, seek them out, respect them, listen to what they say, engage them in discussion. Because they are very often misled. They often believe the big lies. Give them the truth. And if you've got cell phones and other things going off, turn them off. You know, I was on a television program not that long ago, and I was talking with a conservative, and we were having a good discussion. We were actually not shouting at each other. And in my ear, at station break, came the producer who said, "Be angrier." And I said, actually, I don't want to be angry because we're actually getting someplace. We're having a good discussion, and I think, well, I didn't want to say this baldly, but he was actually coming over to my side, and I wanted to make sure that the public could see a model of a discussion of people who disagreed but could actually revise their views. Producer said, "I'm sorry, you've got to be angrier." And I said, "I don't want to be." She said, "That people are right now, they're surfing through 100 channels. They stop when they see a good fight. We have 10 seconds until airtime. Be angrier." And at that moment, I lost my temper. But my point with you is respect people who disagree with you and talk to them. Seek them out. In fact, I've tried to, I live in Berkeley, California. Can you imagine how much dissent there is? I can't find anybody who disagrees with me. But I've made the suggestion, and people scoff at this, they think it's silly, but I've made the suggestion that Berkeley have a sister city. Somewhere in maybe Oklahoma. About the same size. We have pen pals or email pals. And we're assigned arbitrarily email pals, and we talk to each other, and we actually, why in the world, what are you hearing, and why do you have that? Part of organizing is talking to people who disagree with you. Yes?
I've not heard this idea from anybody else, but why don't we get rid of the yearly cap on Social Security in favor of a lifetime cap? Because you have people like athletes that make a lot of money in 1 year and might be disabled and never make a dime, or you have somebody who makes very little money over their career, and then at the end of their career, all of a sudden make a lot of money on their novel or whatever it is. And in either case, Social Security should get the funding.
Yeah. So the question is, why don't we have a lifetime cap on Social Security? another option is, why don't we take the cap off Social Security altogether? In other words, why should we have we have no cap on the portion of the payroll tax that goes to Medicare. We have no cap on the portion of the payroll tax that goes to unemployment insurance. So why do we have a cap on the portion of the payroll tax that goes to Social Security? When I last looked, and I said this to a few of you before, Bill Gates, just to take, I don't want to pick on him, but I think that he, as far as I can calculate, finishes paying his Social Security payroll obligations for the year at about 3 minutes past midnight on January 1st. So, you know, again, I think these are valid ideas, and there are a lot of ideas, and they're good ideas around, but we're not going to get anywhere unless we're organized. Yes?
What one thing of all the concerns and issues do you feel is the thing that would start this fundamental change? For me, it's corporate campaign finance reform. What would be your number one thing to do if you only had to pick one?
Well, if I had to pick one, I would say probably getting money out of politics would be the number one. But, you see, the fallacy of picking one, and I know we're all tempted to say, my issue, education, or healthcare, or corporate finance, or inequality, or whatever it is, or my community, or my issue is the key, it's the number one thing. And that is a fallacy. And that splits us up. That causes progressives to actually start competing for money and start competing against each other. What we need to have in our heads is a holistic view of the problem. We need to understand how the dots connect to each other. Yes.
You know, you quasi in jest had people raise their hand who were members of the baby boomer generation, and the majority of people here did raise their hand. And I think what worries me in regard to that is that it's my generation that really needs to take hold of this and get angry like they did during the Vietnam War. You have the unique position of being on a campus where many people in my generation are very active. Have you seen anything that has worked that we could use on a grander scope, whether it's at Berkeley or in your travels, to get younger people, you know, the 25 to 35, if you will, or even younger than that, to care?
Well, let me stop right there, because the question is a good one. Younger people, 25 to 35 or under 25, how to get them active, how to get them engaged. My experience, not just at Berkeley, all around the country, because I talk a lot to college undergraduates, my experience is that young people are more involved today in terms of public service and their communities than ever before. But when it comes to the big picture, politics, that's when the cynicism kicks in. And so what our task is, as progressives, we're worried about the country, and we know that politics is the key, because that's where the rules get made of how the system is going to be organized in the future. Our goal, and I do it whenever I can, is to explain to young people, you are concerned about your community, you're concerned about public service, you're doing a lot of wonderful things in the schools, but nothing really fundamentally is going to change until you change the way the system is structured. And so take some of your energies and apply them to coalition building, to organizing, mobilizing, and energizing around politics, around not only 2012, but over the longer term. And that's an important message. If they were not already very involved in their communities, then I would be worried, but they are. You just have to change the frame of reference. There's some questions in the back. We have time for one more question. Is there somebody...
right here in the middle.
Somebody,
in the middle.
Way there. There he is. Yes, sir. And by the way, since this is my last question, if you could make this a doozy of a question. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I don't have a chance anymore, so I'd like you to ask a question that enables me to summarize everything I've said with such force and effect and inspirational potential that people just feel great.
How can we How can we form?
Wait. We have two questions at the same time.
How can we
Sir,
form?
Sir, wait a minute.
Oh, excuse me.
You with a beard. I am in favor of beards, but if you could sit down for a moment. And we have the person all the way in the back. I apologize. You and I, we can talk later. I'll come right up to you and we can talk. Right? Yes, all the way in the back.
How much are they trying to tax the 2%?
How much are they trying?
The top 2% are getting taxed. The top 2% get.
Oh, the tax rate right now on the top 2%. Right now, a very large portion of people who are at the top are paying 15%, because that's the capital gains rate, and much of their income is coming in as capital gains. And it's coming in as capital gains partly because that's what they do, like Warren Buffett, but it's also coming in as capital gains because they hire tax attorneys whose job it is to change their ordinary income and make it look like capital gains. So as long as the capital gains rate is different from the ordinary income rate, we're going to have these gains. One part of tax reform is to make capital gains and ordinary income the same. Yeah. Which gets me to the larger point. Doesn't really get me to the larger point, but it gives me an excuse to get to the larger point. All of these issues, inequality, tax reform, our failure to invest in our schools, our failure to invest adequately in infrastructure, the political capture by the right, the lies that are being told over and over and over again, the failure of progressives to be activist and organized enough to push Obama and to get the people we want in the White House, but also in Congress, to do what the middle class and the lower middle class and the working class and the poor need doing. And by the way, all of the polls, amazingly, the Gallup polls and other polls are more and more with us. You ask them, should taxes be raised on the top? What do the Gallup polls show us? A majority of Americans say yes. So all of these dots are connected, which gives us a huge opportunity. Looked at one way, the lousy economy, lousy politics, and a lousy Supreme Court seem to be a perfectly awful trifecta. But looked at another way, this is our moment in history. Yeah.